I'm trying to do here, which is really to educate you into the big system of the world, the Plato's cave that you're born into, and how you're controlled, how your mind is controlled. It always is, always has been. It's being controlled right now with this whole thing in Japan even, for a much bigger purpose, because it all falls along the agenda of Agenda 21 and the Millennium Project, and the rewilding, all that stuff, getting the folk into the cities, austerity, it's all coming down at the same time. And as I said so many times, if old Nick himself was in charge of this, I wouldn't be surprised, because you can't get this kind of luck when you plan all this stuff in advance. You have world meetings about bringing people down into basically very austere levels with very little energy, which you'll pay a lot of money for, an awful lot of money. Big profits off giving out very little, and that's what they're going to do in the future. And they're going to use this happening in Japan to bring down basically your plants across the world. They've already banned coal. That's to be phased out. So what are you left with if you don't have coal and you don't have nuclear energy? What are you faced with, really? They won't allow you. Remember, the same boys who own the big private nuclear facilities across the world are the same big boys who own the oil industry. They own the industries that are setting up the windmills everywhere, which they'll be in charge of too. And alternate power. Same boys who are moving into a different arena with their money, and they want you to go for higher priced electricity, vastly higher priced electricity, and they want you to get a lot less per week of electricity for an awful lot more money. That's not a bad deal for them too. And remember too that your nice pretty lifestyles right now are going to plummet. Going to plummet, folks, if you all panic right now, as you're supposed to do, and start crying out for these plants across the world to be taken down. Number one, there's only one going down, and that's in Japan, who've been hit with a massive, incredible earthquake, then a tsunami on top of it. And then these reactors, of course, were taken down one after another in quick succession. We've watched so many scary end-of-the-world movies that have churned out in the last 10 or 12 years that most folk really think it's the end of the world. It's astonishing. And you can truly have your perceptions distorted by being fixated on television. There was a BBC documentary series put out a while back on that very topic, and how it distorts your mind, and how fear itself is something that you will pay attention to when it's fear-based propaganda that's being thrown out at you. And the amygdala of the brain basically is your survival part for very primitive instincts, but survival is part of it. And it gets hyper-sensitized to any warnings of danger. And that's why you can't take your eyes away from it. That's why the big boys like Sunstein and so on know to give you psychic driving, the same images over and over and over again. Same what they did with 9/11 for the towers. Ad nauseum for weeks and weeks and weeks, until it was literally burned into your brain, into your mind. And whenever you see that again, the same fear dwells up inside of you. It's embedded in your mind. So remember, let's not lose our heads over this, and let's not go along with the big agenda, because they're bringing in a new feudal system they've written about for many times in all their big publications. Professor Carol Quigley talked about it too. And they want you to be all on board, demanding, and that's how they do things. They get you to demand the very things they want to happen. It's not a bad idea, but it's a terrific system. It always works, never fails. And right now, from the Council on Foreign Relations, of course, the big player for the globalists is Japan's impact on U.S. nuclear power. And I said this the very first day this would happen, because, you see, they've had all the world meetings, and they're trying to convince the public to go along with rolling blackouts and austerity, etc., etc., etc. Remember, you're post-consumer now. They've said that too, which means that your disposable income will not go towards little goodies and trinkets and all the cheap junk from China you keep buying to reward yourselves for working. It'll go instead of to fees and taxes and higher payments for so-called services like electricity. That's where it's all to go. And your tax money will be used to fund all these new projects for the big boys, who will then be handed it as a private gift, basically, from the government to them, once it's all up and running. And then they'll really gauge you, and gouge you, I should say, for every penny you've got, for every little volt and amp of electricity you consume. And that's just the facts of it, folks. And it's not to downplay the catastrophe in Japan whatsoever, but who's been hit with 3 things like that in a row, all at the same time? Nobody. Now, the CFR says, by Michael A. Levi, David M. Rubenstein, Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment and Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change. You notice every country now, it's not energy and so on, it's energy and climate change. It's all tacked onto it now. The Japanese nuclear crisis continues to unfold with the ultimate outcome still unknown, but observers have already turned to the day 2 question: what does this disaster mean for the future of U.S. nuclear power? There's no doubt that on the margin it will hurt. How much so remains to be seen. Then they go on and talk about all the other catastrophes they've had with the oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico and all that kind of stuff. And then they go into the evolution of public opinion. Nice term there, isn't it? The evolution of public opinion is still far from over, though the ultimate policy consequences of the Japanese crisis will depend on precisely how the situation on the ground develops over the coming weeks, just as it did over the oil spills many months. Those details are impossible to predict right now, and don't you kid yourself, these guys are monitoring everything as it happens, and big world meetings are taking place to see if they can get their agenda through. Much depends on technical matters that are not known to the public and exactly how the stricken reactors respond to the stresses that they are now under. And nuclear power provides about 20% of the U.S. electricity, but new construction has been stalled for decades by the mix of high costs and public apprehension dating back to the 1979 accident at 3 Mile Island. Opposition to nuclear power has softened slightly in recent years, but the old patterns of debate remain largely intact. So they're bringing up all the old accidents too. Now remember again, these same boys, as I say, at the top, that own basically the world's energy supplies, who will also be charging you for carbon taxes or energy taxes and all the rest of it, are the same boys who privately own, and they own the majority shares in all these big corporations, be it at home or abroad. They're internationalists. They have no nation as far as you're concerned. They own the transition into so-called sustainable energy, and these awful windmills that they have to get shut down during a kind of high breeze. It's just too much to take before they fall apart. And of course, they can hardly churn enough out, and they definitely even can't pay for their own manufacture or keep or maintenance. And that's what they want to bring you back to. But the big boys will own them for sure, which means if you're going to pay for them, you'll pay an awful, awful, awful lot of money. And it will be funded by the taxpayer for private business. Again, don't forget that. So really they're going into pro-nuclear forces and anti-nuclear forces and all the rest of it. And remember too, these big boys with their foundations, their front organizations and NGOs also control the environmental societies and agencies and NGOs. And in fact, they've used them in the past to stop the hydroelectric dams. And Canada could certainly put up quite enough of those if they wanted to, but they didn't do it because the big boys at that time wanted their nuclear. Now they want something else, you see, a new system. And again, you'll pay for it all. So if they bring down the coal plants, which they've already signed agreements to do so, and the coal, basically modern coal plants pollute very little because of scrubbers and the massive filters and all the rest of them. And they're great work engines. They just keep going and going and going and put out a lot of electricity. And you're living in a first world nation, most of you out there, and you need that kind of power to keep things going. You definitely need it. You won't get that on your little windmills. That's for sure. So keep your own head too as we go through all of this. There's no doubt about it. We're all worried about the radiation floating over Canada, the US. It's supposed to hit now, and it's probably been hitting already, I'm sure. Everyone's praying to have no rain to bring it down, and bingo, just when the show started, a thunderstorm started, and down came the rain. Well, that's the way it goes, eh? They say that God doesn't like trailer sites and things like that. But he's certainly got a strange sense of humor. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, we're back and cutting through the matrix. Just talking about not to lose your heads while this is happening. And of course the hype in the media is intended to make you all lose your heads and to make you stampede along in a direction which the big boys who own the big nuclear plants want you to go, because they're the same massive shareholders who own the majority shares of all the other alternate energy systems are bringing out now through all these meetings. Look who attends these big meetings worldwide, and look at all the NGOs they fund as well. That's no coincidence. They're all in bed together. And it would be very nice if we lived in a real system with nice real people and all the rest of it. But we don't. We live in a very devious world with devious people running our countries. That's the only kind who can actually get up into power, in fact. And it's the same with all these various groups, these power groups. They're all socio-political power groups with their own top leaders, all vying for power amongst themselves, but definitely always trying to fool you and sway what they call public opinion. It's not hard to create any kind of public opinion in any direction at all. It's very simple to do. So they used to say too that I noticed with the stock markets in New York and elsewhere, they actually had articles about the greatest yard sale, the greatest fire sale ever, as the sharks once again try to buy up the yen and buy up factories that are abroad from Japan and so on. A great big fire sale, as they say, because, and I said before, the night before, that Rothschild said you make your money when the blood is running in the streets. So the sharks, the crooks, the evil characters of the world are right in on this, on top of this, to grab what they can. And whenever they always say that one man's misfortune is another man's fortune, and they really believe in that. They have no qualms about it whatsoever, and they're going at it big time. But we've got to, as I say, keep our heads as they go through all of this, and not to get carried away, to give the big boys what they want. We are not in a world where free power of any kind, free energy of any kind will be available to the public, because it will never be allowed. The whole system we're going into is where you are interdependent. That means you're totally dependent on the system, and for all your needs, they'll come from the system. They'll be dished out by the system. And that's why there's so many sciences which definitely have been suppressed, because you can't give power to the people literally in any shape or form if you want to hold power over the people. And those with common sense know that and understand that, and certainly those who've read their histories and read the articles, and even from the websites of the big corporations that run the world. It's not going to happen. We're dealing with very devious people, very, very devious people. And suddenly everyone's forgot about the Kyoto conferences they've had, that the many ones have signed away all your rights to do with power and so on. You've forgotten about all the environmental movements, meetings they've had at Copenhagen, etc. And you've forgotten that your own governments, right at this time, are in the process of closing down the coal-fired plants. So you better start thinking, if you want to go back to reading by candles and begging for a charge to have your little iPhone charged up for you so you can yap away for hours on end and tweet away on Twitter to all your supposed friends. You better think very hard and carefully about it, and don't be stampeded by the power of television. It's changed the world, the television, completely.